racism in the antebellum period. We won't touch on the racism directed towards African Americans, the racism related to slavery. We're going to look at the other forms of racism in this time period. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to check off these two concepts from your outline for Unit 5. Let's start in California with the gold rush. At the local level, miners in mining towns and mining camps formed what were called claims clubs. These are like informal courts that are established to settle disagreements over land claims. And white Europeans, Australians, white Americans from the East Coast were for the most part treated pretty fairly, and their claims were recognized. Everybody else, Native Americans, Mexicans, Chileans, and later Chinese miners were expelled from the valuable claims and given only really the land that was least valuable, least likely to have gold. One Chilean immigrant remarked that the officials in the mining towns, he saw their job as this: in a dispute between a Yankee and someone who speaks Spanish, it is the job of the official to declare the Spanish speaker guilty and make him pay the court costs. Up at the territory level of government, the California Territory in 1850 creates what's called a foreign miners tax, which required Asian miners and Latin American miners to pay an additional tax when they engaged in mining. It's a blatantly racist law that discouraged many Latinos and many Asian miners, like Chinese miners, from pursuing mining anymore. Eventually, those gold claims dry up, and that gold that's available on the surface is all collected. The only remaining gold is the kind deep down below that can be mined by large companies. Some miners take paying positions on those companies' deep underground mines. Others turn to farming that California land rather than returning back east. But that means they've got to take that land from the people that might be on it. Let's start with Native Americans. Native Americans numbered around 150,000 in California before the gold rush. In less than 15 years, that number is going to drop to 30,000 people. And that quote there from that California territorial governor shows that it wasn't just disease that decimated the Native American population in California after the Mexican-American War and after the gold rush. It is violence and active extermination on the part of white settlers in the area as well. How does the U.S. government get involved? Well, Congress invalidates a number of treaties that had been made with California tribes. They at one time had 7,000 acres of land designated to them by those various treaties. That's going to be reduced to only 25,000 acres on small, cramped reservations on land that was not very good for farming or really anything else. And the federal government refused to provide military protection for Native Americans on reservations. Without federal protection, murder and being kidnapped into slavery was a real threat for Native Americans. This quote from the Northern Californian town of Petaluma, from their newspaper in 1857, really shows the blasé, ho-hum nature that white settlers in the region saw violence towards Native Americans. This is not being reported as a big deal when it should be. Some Native Americans were kidnapped and sold into slavery on large farms. Now, slavery was illegal in California, but there's a federal government that's very far away that's not really able to enforce it. And for Native American women, sexual assault was a real problem. Some of them were even basically kidnapped and married into domestic servitude of white miners and farmers. The result is that those Native American populations in California are left devastated by that population loss. And they're so spread out that they can no longer be distinct communities like they were before. They might have to merge with other tribes, and that really leads to a loss of Native American culture. How about Mexicans in California? Because remember, it was a Mexican state before it was part of the U.S. Well, those Mexican Americans who were granted citizenship by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo oftentimes had claims to their land in California. Now, Those claims were sometimes hard to validate. They might be centuries old family claims, and many of them were ranchers, not farmers. So there wasn't as much evident work on the land as you might expect. But 75% of those land claims were upheld by Congress. They were enforced by Congress. Unfortunately, Anglo-Americans from the East moved to California and just squatted on some of that Mexican-American owned land. They argued that those Mexican-Americans had not improved the land. They had not done anything to it to make it profitable, to make it productive. So those squatters are going to pressure local judges to invalidate or reduce those Mexican-American claims. This was common in the Jacksonian era in almost all parts of the U.S. that were being developed. As a result of this pressure from squatters, many Mexican Americans just gave up on their claim and sold their land to them, oftentimes at a loss. Let's look at nativism. Factories expanded with Irish immigration. Bridgets, Irish women, were hired as domestic laborers. Throughout American towns and cities in the Midwest and the North, German signs are popular in storefronts, and German foods like sausages and hamburgers are becoming a popular staple of the American diet. But some Americans were concerned over these immigrants. After all, the Irish led to a growth in the slums in cities, the tenement buildings that really looked awful and were crime-infested, polluted areas of town. There's also a concern that the Irish are leading to lower wages for American workers. After all, they were used to break strikes. And there was a long history of English-speaking people discriminating against the Irish, dating back to colonial times. The temperance movement also could be seen as an anti-immigrant movement. After all, the Irish visited the saloon on a regular basis, but you would too if you didn't have a living room in your tenement apartment. The Germans spent Sundays at the beer garden, as was their tradition, as was their custom when they lived in Germany. These things allow Americans to blame the immigrants for their troubles. It allows them to blame the Irish for their economic struggles, saying that they're too drunk, they drink too much, and that's why they're in poverty, not racism or other factors. Another concern is that the Germans continue to kind of live secluded. The Germans continue to speak German. They continue to read German language newspapers and patronize German-only businesses. And from that, it looks like they're not willing to assimilate with the rest of America. And let's not forget the anti-Catholicism element of anti-immigrant feelings in the antebellum period. Remember, almost all of those Irish immigrants and 1/3 of the German immigrants were Catholics, coming to a nation that's almost entirely Protestant Christians. Many Protestant Christians viewed the Pope as an authoritarian, and they thought that Catholics just listened to the Pope for everything that they did. So it wasn't a big leap in logic for many of those Protestant Americans to think that Catholics would not be able to develop the independent judgment that was needed to be a citizen in a democracy. Many Protestants assumed or feared that Catholics would just listen to the Pope and vote however the Pope told them to. There was also an anti-slavery connection to the anti-Catholicism of nativism. Countries like Cuba and Haiti and Mexico had a very high Catholic population. There was real concern that a rising Catholic population from Irish immigration in America would lead to more of a push to annex or add Cuba and Haiti and Mexico to the United States. And since all of those places are south of the Missouri Compromise line, are southern countries, are places where slavery was practiced at one time, there's real concern that those places would enter the nation as slave states. How did the Irish respond to some of these criticisms and attacks? Well, unfortunately, some of the Irish respond in a way that does not help their public image. There is mob violence from some of the Irish in some of the cities like New York and Boston. In particular, Irish immigrants targeted African Americans, not because of just blatant racism, but also because African Americans were competition for the Irish for those jobs at the bottom rung of the economy. There was also Irish mob violence directed towards temperance parades and temperance groups because, perhaps rightly so, the Irish really felt targeted by those temperance efforts. And there was Irish mob violence targeted towards abolitionist meetings and abolitionist speeches, because if all African Americans were immediately freed from bondage in the South, then those freed slaves would become additional competition for poor Irish workers. And remember, abolitionists were also calling for immediate citizenship, immediate equal rights. Well, to many immigrants, especially the Irish, who had to wait 7 years for naturalization to become full citizens, this didn't seem fair. Now, German immigrants angered some Southern Americans with their support for the abolitionist movement. Their background and support of socialist movements in Germany before they left resulted in many German immigrants supporting the abolitionist movement, and that puts them on the bad side of some planters and Southern slave owners. Here's a political cartoon from the era showing a concern of some Americans that this is what was happening in the cities, that the Irish, they're on the left, depicted as an Irish whiskey barrel, and the German, they're on the right, depicted as a beer barrel, are stealing what? That's the ballot box between the two of them. So we have our first really anti-immigrant actions as early as the mid-19 or 1830s, where you have some American-born citizens calling for a halt or a stop to immigration. And you have mob violence directed towards the Irish, particularly Irish youth. In 1844, a group known as the American Republican, or more commonly just the American Party, swept New York City elections on a platform on policies of temperance, anti-Catholicism, and strong nativism, this opposition to immigrants. And really a big push early on is to extend the waiting period for immigrants to become citizens. That way, it takes even longer for the Irish and the Germans to, quote, steal the ballot, because they don't become citizens until longer than 7 years. In 1850, we have the emergence of what's known as the Know Nothing Party. They grow out of, or they might actually be the same people as the American Party that preceded it. But when asked what they were doing or what their group was about, the common refrain was, "I know nothing." They started as a secret anti-immigrant society, but grow into a public political party. And they are denouncing, they are speaking out against, they are writing newspapers against the Irish and German menace. And their goals include discouraging further immigration, and even they would like to introduce literacy tests for voting. Antebellum nativism, this anti-immigrant sentiment in politics, reaches its peak in 1854. In that year, dozens of Know Nothing Party members are elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. They join Congress. And in that same year, Know Nothings gained control. They seized a majority in the Pennsylvania and Massachusetts state legislatures. However, this peak of nativism does not last very long. In that same year, Senator Stephen Douglas introduces the growing idea of popular sovereignty with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And very quickly, the spread of slavery and the future of slavery becomes a much more important national issue than any foreign immigrant threat.